Hello, and welcome to the Jewish Heretics Podcast. This is the official podcast of the United Jewish People's Order, a progressive Canadian Jewish organization that's been around since the 1920s. My name's David Wall. I am the community's cultural programmer, and I'll be your host. For this, the 17th episode of our podcast, I had the honor of speaking to journalist and producer Samira Mohyeddin. For nearly 10 years, Samira was a producer and host at CBC Radio and CBC Podcasts. She resigned in November of 2023 and founded the quite popular and journalistically rigorous On the Line Media. Samira has a Master of Arts in Modern Middle Eastern History and Gender from the University of Toronto and Genocide Studies from the Zorian Institute. She is currently the 2024-2025 Journalism Fellow at the Women and Gender Studies Institute at the University of Toronto. These days, Samira is also busy at work on a documentary about the People's Circle for Palestine student encampment at the University of Toronto. Our conversation covered a wide range of topics, including her background in theater, her experiences as a young Iranian expatriate and how they helped shape her politics, and the complexities of so-called objective journalism, especially in the face of genocide. Here's our conversation. Samira Mohyeddin, thanks so much for taking the time out to be on our podcast. How are you today?
Thank you, David. I'm not well. I'm going to answer you truthfully. I'm not well.
Oh dear. And do you mean psychologically, physically? I'm so hard to hear that.
No, just it's a very the psychological is physical these days for me. So it's a very sort of intestinal disgust. I just listened to CBC's Metro Morning, where David Common was interviewing the former Canadian ambassador to John Allen, and John Allen mentions the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and David Common says it's hard to know what's going on there because there are no independent voices inside Gaza. That is verbatim quote from a CBC journalist. So I'm not well. It's disgusting. It's vile. I'm embarrassed for so many people that I used to think of as colleagues. It's embarrassing, the level of journalism.
I get it, and we'll get into all that. And I apologize for my trite question that was just a sort of icebreaker opener there. I just want to start by showering you with potentially embarrassing praise, just to set the scene here. So in the last year at least, you were one of the journalists I've looked to for, I'd say, moral and factual clarity, especially but not exclusively in the context of the genocide in Gaza and how to grapple with it. You're incredibly articulate, bold, and also hilarious. I can't think of it.
Thank you for recognizing my humor.
I can't think of another online. I was just watching yesterday. I can't think of another online pundit of your stature who can get away with starting a report with, "Hi, it's me, Samira Mohyeddin, class clown," which to me is worthy of both kinds of marks, Carl and Groucho.
Thank you so much.
So congratulations.
Thank you very much. I always appreciate when people recognize these sorts of things, because a lot of people just pass them by. And, I have a lot of layers to me, and I always try, and unfortunately, I see the absurd in everything. That is something that I cannot not see. And I often get in trouble for it. And I get reminders from managing editors that you are not a satirist. And I always say, this is all theater. It truly, to me, when you just scrape everything away, it's all such theater.
On this podcast, we like to talk about origin stories, as in, where did you get your radical superpowers? You immigrated to Canada in 1979. And can you tell me about your childhood a bit? What were your parents like? Were they politically progressive?
Sure. We landed in Canada on May 4th, 1979. So may the 4th be with you. And my parents were 28. My mom was 28. My father was 31. and they left Iran during a very tumultuous time. This was during the revolution of 1979. My mom, I credit with the superpower. She, in Iran, was going to protests against the revolution, which in and of itself takes a lot of guts because, as you know, sort of when a tide gets moving, those who do not follow suit often become the victims. And she was speaking out against Khomeini, against the revolution, against the changes she was seeing in her society. And after a while, realized, oh no, things are, this isn't a joke. Things are going really badly, and decided to come to Canada. And we landed here, and the first couple of years, my parents didn't think that we would be staying here. They thought things would go back to normal. But then after a while, they realized they need to put down roots here. My first, when we came to Canada, we actually were in a place called Drummondville for the first year, which is in eastern Quebec. And so my first introduction to Canada was a lot of baling of hay and tractor rides, because my aunt had come here many years earlier and had an industrial farm here in this town of Drummondville, which was a town of 500. So my parents could only last there about a year. You know, coming from a city of 8 million to a town of 500 wasn't exactly what they were looking for. And so then we moved to Toronto. But I came from a very politically progressive household. Politics was something that was constantly debated. I grew up with it around the kitchen table. And so I really credit my family and my parents for that. Now that the sort of clownish part comes from my father, who never was embarrassed by doing anything that he felt the need to do at any time. My father was the type of man who, if he heard a good song, he would start dancing in the parking lot, or he would constantly break out in song. He would sing, whether it was at family occasions or other things. And so I am a complete sort of 50-50 of the both of them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's interesting. There's many ways, of course, to metabolize and escape from an oppressive regime. And one way is to embrace reactionary politics. I'm thinking, for example, of people I know who left the Soviet Union and are virulent anti-communists and all that entails. But you have maintained a consistent, at least it seems this way, radical left outlook. Can you talk about your journey as both a critic of Iran's regime and simultaneously say Canada's neoliberalism, right-wing politics, Zionism?
Yeah, I mean, it's, again, David, I don't know you very well, but you seem to be very astute. You're picking up on things that a lot of people, when they interview me, don't touch on. I do call out the Iranian government in most of my work that I do. People know me from that work. But at the same time, I do call out the hypocrisy of the West when it positions itself as the beacon of human rights and democracy, etc., which in the past 19 months has just been completely eradicated and shattered. And so it's a fine line. You know, I at times feel like I'm dancing on the head of a pin. And what's really interesting is the way people try to position me depending on what their own politics are. So during the past 19 months, specifically during this genocide, you will get people calling me a Hamasnik, a terrorist. And then these are the same exact people who privately would write to me, you know, during the Mahsa Amini uprising in Iran and say, you know, you are the best person in our community. We love you. I'm speaking about Iranians here. You know, thank you so much for speaking out and blah, 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 being our representative. So the same people that were praising me then are now, you know, putting me to the stake today. And that's because I've realized, because I sort of navigate all these various identities, right? Queer, Iranian, Muslim, but secular, you know, all of this. everybody wants a different piece of me at different times. And I really have no allegiances to any of these identities. I don't, they are things that are almost heaped onto me, and it doesn't matter to me. I'm not loyal to any one of them at any particular time. But I will say that in the past 19 months, I have never ever been so I will say afraid. I have been at times afraid for my physical safety, for the physical safety of my loved ones, because of speaking out on what Israel is doing in Gaza. And that is something that I never felt before. I have never had my sexuality or my gender weaponized against me in the way that I have in the past 19 months. And it's really, really just a scary time to be someone that speaks the truth on what Israel is doing.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting to look at your outspoken critique of the Iranian regime, but also your outspoken critique of Israel and Zionism, because they are pitted against each other. It's like they're contrasted, they're enemies, and so there tend to be camps in the either or, and that's certainly not your perspective. And I find it refreshing and interesting. Do you have lots of allies in, say, an Iranian context who feel the same way?
I do, actually, but they are afraid to voice that. And I get a lot of direct messages, private messages from people saying, thank you so much for saying this. It's horrible what's happening, but I'm afraid to, or my family is this, or, stuff like that. And it's so sad because, on the one hand, people call you incredibly brave. And then on the other hand, I think to myself, what would the world be like if all of us just said what we wanted to? It shouldn't be a radical point of view to speak the truth about what Israel is doing right now, or about Zionism in general. But that's sort of where we're at. And people who don't understand Iran, don't quite understand the way that Palestine is used by the Islamic Republic as a almost as a weapon against Israel, because the politics of this and the way that Iran uses Palestine is not something that is to be revered, is not something that is to look at as, oh wow, Iran is the only country that speaks out against Israel. Well, I have a deep understanding for Iranians who say, I don't support what the Palestinians are doing. I have an understanding of it, but I still find it disgusting. And the reason I say that is because people don't quite know that when you live in Iran as a child you grow up in very much a totalitarian society, and that every morning one of the things that you start off the school day with is death to Israel, death to America. Now, if you hate your government, right, and you grow up under this and you hate your government, and your government is anti-Israel or anti-American, the juvenile thing to do is to then become pro-Israeli and pro-American, right? So that's sort of what a lot of people in Iran, their whole idea is that if my government is for these things, well, then I'm going to be against it. And one of the things that is so embedded in the Iranian mind is this photo of Yasser Arafat being the first, person to come and visit Khomeini and the new Iranian regime in 1979, right? So there is this idea that the Palestinians are somehow to blame for what happened to Iran in 1979. And this is a thought that a lot of Iranians have. And it won't go away. And Israel itself, and I have to say this for anyone who is listening out there, I suggest you do this. Go and follow the IDF Farsi page. on Instagram. Israel has a IDF page that is all in Persian. And the amount of propaganda that is sent out to Iranians is so effective. It's so effective. And there is a reason Israel does this, because it's found a little, nugget of truth in that, a lot of Iranians believe this, and it's just expounds on it in a way that is wild to behold. I start my morning off every day with IDF propaganda. I am someone who I love propaganda. I love looking at propaganda, and I love pointing it out. And just nobody does it like Israel does. I have to give kudos to Israeli Hasbara. It is wild, and in so many languages, And I started this back in long time ago. I started this back in 2009. I find Iran's regime and Israel very similar in their propaganda and in a lot of the things that their military does. The bulldozing of homes, the way that they keep prisoners' bodies from families, the way that they don't allow people to mourn or have funerals or celebrate when prisoners are released. These are identical tactics that both Iran and Israel use. No one else does this. No other country's government withholds the dead bodies of prisoners, but Iran and Israel do. And people don't know a lot of this, but the similarities between these two countries is so wild.
That's amazing. Fascinating. I had never thought that way. I want to take do a real left turn here and go back a bit to your just your career, because you're a fascinating person. You say you're multi-layered. I was amazed, but somehow not surprised, for example, that you studied theater and Shakespeare. And I'm not surprised because you have this charismatic flair when you speak. And this ability to think on your toes and be spontaneous, and to talk in paragraphs. Can you talk about what your what that theatrical study entailed, and how it crossed over into your journalism?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. My love of theater started in high school, and it was all because of one teacher who pushed me after high school to audition for a conservatory called the American Musical and Dramatic Academy in Manhattan. And I remember my mom clearly saying to me, "I cannot afford this school." And I said, just drive me to the audition. And it was down at the Marriott in downtown Toronto. And I did the audition, and for the audition, I did the soliloquy from Hamlet, Act 2, Scene 2, playing Hamlet. It was the, "Oh, what a rogue and peasant slave am I, is it not monstrous that this player here," and it goes on. And I remember at the end of the soliloquy, the artistic director of the school said to me, "Come here, young lady." And he beckoned me towards his table. And I was shitting my pants, and I walked over to him and I said, "Yes." And he said, "Don't you dare ever play against your gender."
Oh, goodness.
Yeah. And I thought, oh, I didn't get this. And I did get the scholarship, despite his warning. But I've always
can I just interrupt it? Can I just? The obvious irony is in Shakespeare's day, the women were all played by men.
Exactly. Exactly. I didn't have the guts to sort of bring that up at the time. My knees were knocking, but I did get the scholarship, and I did go to the school. And now, what I realized many years later is that I've always played against type. I didn't, the moment that I thought, people had figured me out and wanted to sort of pigeonhole me, I was like, no, you're not going to do that. And that's something I've carried with me. But to go back to your question about, how have I used my theater in journalism? I am so aware of the behind the scenes of journalism, that to me, it really is all theater. Once the lights go up and, the mic gets held and we do the sound checks and, even as the guests that we bring on, we almost know what that guest is going to say. We have pre-interviewed them. We want them to play a certain role. So all of these characters and I refer to them as characters. We bring on the IDF spokesperson. We know that they're going to sit there and lie to us. And I always think of during this time that I watch these IDF spokespersons, the David Mensers and the Elon Levies. We know they're lying to us. And I always think of Alexander Solzhenitsyn when he would say, he has that essay where he says, we know they're lying to us. They know that we know they're lying to us. We know that they know that they're lying to us. And it just keeps going and going. And yet we still put them on the air and think that we're doing some sort of service to the public. I mean, it's so egregious that the only way that I comfort myself, to be honest with you, David, is to look at it as theater. And I use that in a way to connect with the audience. It's almost like a wink, wink, like, I know you know. Mm-hmm. Because I give my audience a bit more credit than I think a lot of media outlets do. And all of that has really, for me, in the past 19 months, been totally stripped away. People are a lot smarter than we give them credit for. And I think the erosion of trust in the media, that the journalists really need to do some introspection right now and start to look at why it is that erosion has happened. It's not just that everybody wants to pile on top of the media. It's that we had a big role to play in that,
Can you talk about, this really relates, can you talk about the ideas of, quote, objectivity, unquote, in journalism? Did it ever really exist? Does it exist anywhere now? And is objectivity a realistic or even desirable ideal? Objectivity with a capital O. It's always talked about in relation to journalism.
Yeah, I mean, this is a conversation that I think really sparked up a lot during the Black Lives Matter movement, where we started to look at, the police releases, for instance, the media releases that the police would give. And we started questioning, oh, hold on a second, like, okay, so this is what the police say, but that doesn't mean that is what we should be reporting, right? We should start actually looking into what the police say happened. We shouldn't report that as the actual facts. And there was a bit of a reckoning that happened in the media during this time. But objectivity and this idea that there is a view from nowhere, like this sort of omnipotent thing that, I as a journalist, I'm not a human being. I am just this thing that holds a microphone and I will give both sides of the story, right? There's always two sides to everything. Well, sometimes, the story isn't about two sides. Sometimes the story is a circle. And, you have to sort of look at it in that way. But objectivity has become something that is weaponized these days against the truth and against particular journalists, usually journalists of color, who are thought of as being biased, as if to say, you know what? I think it's best to give you some concrete examples. There are New York Times journalists right now who are former IDF soldiers. Now, they are reporting on Gaza. Those journalists are not thought of as being biased. How is that possible? How can you be a former IDF soldier or have children, teenagers mostly, who are in the IDF, and yet you are allowed to report on that with no disclosure, right? Sometimes you'll see journalists say, full disclosure, I was a former soldier, or, for full disclosure, my son is currently fighting in Gaza. It's very rare. You don't see it, right? And those journalists are never withheld from reporting on the area, which is something that we see in newsrooms, right? Somebody will come to you and say, you know what, you're Palestinian, maybe you shouldn't be reporting on this. You're a bit too close to the story. Well, guess what? Jewish journalists are never told that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm speaking from experience here, just things that I've seen within my own experiences in legacy media inside Canada. That is something that just doesn't happen, right? So objectivity has really just fallen, whatever the point of it was before, it really is a meaningless term. It's just something that's become a bat to beat over the heads of journalists who have been telling the truth over the past 19 months. And, I started with talking to you about this clip I heard this morning, which just blew me away. I mean, we have all seen over the past 19 months images of children wasting away, prisoners being released from Israeli jails looking like skeletons. We've seen Israeli hostages coming out of Gaza looking like skeletons. There's no food. There's no aid going in. And yet you have a person like the CBC's David Commons say, well, it's really hard to talk about the humanitarian cause because there are no independent voices in Gaza. What does that mean? That means, A, we don't trust Palestinian journalists.
Mm-hmm.
That's what that means. And that comes back to your question about objectivity, right? B, it also comes back to, what Orwell said in 1984, don't trust your lying eyes and ears. And so we really are in a crisis of truth when it comes to journalism right now.
It's interesting. It's almost, would it be beneficial? Like, what do I love about On the Line, your journalism project, is that everyone knows your proclivities. It's not, it's like, yes, this is my orientation. This is my bias, in quotes. Maybe that's where journalists need to start. and we lose the illusion of some kind of transparent objectivity, which can't possibly exist.
I mean, it would be a great place, if somebody would just come out and say, I support Israel, and it doesn't matter to me what Israel does. I will always support it. And here we go. Here's the coverage that I'm giving you today. Just come out and say it. Have the guts. Don't pretend, with this veneer of objectivity. The media, and I'm using capital M when I say media, and I just want to give this sort of caveat too. There are a lot of great journalists inside the CBC doing excellent coverage, and I will name them, if necessary. But there are people inside the CBC doing great coverage. However, there are managers and executive producers who are not allowing a lot of work to come out, and there are hosts like David Common who will dehumanize Palestinian journalists by making such asinine statements when they're doing interviews. So, it's hard to say the media is doing this. However, I think we can say overall that the coverage has been abysmal and at times complicit. And so I haven't ever come out and said specifically, I support the Palestinian cause. Because it's not, I think, relevant to what I'm saying. I am still reporting facts. I am still reporting the truth. I don't report this issue as a 50-50 sort of type of journalism, because I don't think that there is any balance in this story.
Right.
And I'm also not reporting on a soccer game, for me to sit there and say, oh, so-and-so scored and now so-and-so is going to do this. Like, that's not what is happening here. You have one of the world's most strong militaries bombing people who are living in tattered tents. What is the allegiance? The allegiance is to the people, right? I mean, and I come back to this idea that journalism, this adage, and I'm not sure if, people know this, but a lot of people think of journalism as something that is to comfort the afflicted, and afflict the comfortable. And I'll use a quote here from Shakespeare, one of my favorite soliloquies, where he says, he's comparing himself to this actor, and he says, why can't I be like this actor? And he says, what would I do had he the motive and the cue for passion? He would cleave the general ear with horrid speech, make mad the guilty and appall the free, and confound the ignorant. Now, make mad the guilty and appall the free. That is the root of the journalism that I do.
Fantastic. That's Hamlet, yeah?
That's Hamlet, right? And that, to me, is what the root of journalism should be. Justice.
Amazing.
Justice should be the root of journalism. Everything else is just theater. I can't remember who said that, but everything else is just PR. And I think it was Orwell again who said that. George Orwell.
You've given me an excellent segue into my next bit, which is I was at an event a little while back where, was it last week, where you talked about why you left the CBC, the juicy story. Can you tell that story and also talk about your infamous run-in with management over a post? And I understand that you left CBC for a bunch of reasons, but I would like to hear you tell that story.
I mean, when I resigned from the CBC, it was at a very tumultuous time. So Israel, the Hamas attacks happened on October 7th. And that first week, I started being called into my managing editor's office for my social media posts, and it was a litany of stuff. But the story that I told at the event that we were at, this was at Another Story bookshop, and they were discussing Ahed Tamimi's memoir. They Call Me a Lioness. And the story that I told had to do with Nancy Waugh. This is the CBC senior manager of journalistic standards and principles. So every media outlet has their own journalistic standards and principles, or media ethics, or what they go by. And I was called into my managing editor's office because of a tweet I put out in response to something that Itamar Ben-Gvir had written on his Twitter page. Ahed Tamimi on November 6th, 2023, was kidnapped from her bed at 4 a.m. for a social media post that she denies writing, and which later was proven to be bullshit. But she was kidnapped from her bed, and Itamar Ben-Gvir posted that he was very happy that she was kidnapped from her bed, and that this is how you deal with terrorists. So he was calling Ahed Tamimi a terrorist. And so I went on my Twitter page and I wrote that Itamar Ben-Gvir is praising the IDF for kidnapping Ahed Tamimi from her bed at 4 a.m. And an organization called Honest Reporting complained to the CBC about my tweet, saying that I left out important context in that tweet. Now, what was the context? The context was the lie. So the context was what Ahed Tamimi denied writing, which was her saying, I believe something like, we're going to suck all your blood and what Hitler did to you is going to be a joke, etc. So I left that part out. Sorry, go ahead.
Just totally out of character for her. So, I mean, it just makes no sense.
She's never said anything like that. She's never done that. And if you even look up Ahead Tamimi's social media pages, I think there are about 15 different Ahead Tamimi social media accounts. And even AFP, this is Agence France Presse, when they reported on it, wrote that Ahead Tamimi denies this, etc. And I myself, before I even put out that tweet, looked at these social media accounts. And so Nancy Wah agreed with Honest Reporting and said that my tweet did not live up to the journalistic standards and principles of the CBC. And they said that I should have included, quote unquote, the context. So context here equals the lie. Mm-hmm. And I'd gotten to a point, David, where I'm just too old to lie. I finally, after 15 years, finished paying off my student loan. It was around $40,000 of post-secondary education. I have a master's in modern Middle Eastern history and am a graduate of genocide studies from the Zorion Institute. And I finally paid off that student loan. And I just realized during this time of what was going on and being brought in over and over again into my managing editor's office, this was happening 2 to 3 times a week over a span of a month and a half. I realized that I'm just too old to lie. And I was doing a disservice to all of my years of post-secondary education on Israel-Palestine. And the $40,000 I had spent and becoming a journalist and then being asked to lie about everything that I knew and everything that I had spent years educating myself on. My knowledge of the region, its history, was an asset, was a liability for my employer. It was not an asset. And I realized I can't be somewhere where knowledge is a liability. Mm-hmm. That's what journalists today who are not simping for Israel are grappling with, right? How am I going to be employable with this knowledge? Who's going to take me on? Not many people, I can assure you. Mm-hmm.
So you leave CBC and you start your amazing journalism project On the Line. So when did you start that, and what was the concept initially?
The concept, first and foremost, was to act as a bulwark against the vile type of journalism that I was seeing come out during this specific 19 months. And I started with going back. I started with trying to provide people with a historical context of what they were seeing. Because unfortunately, what people don't realize is that none of this is new. And it's so, as someone who understands where all of this comes from, the root causes, we don't like to talk about root causes, but the root causes of what we're seeing today is so cyclical. Even the announcement that came from Netanyahu yesterday that we are going to occupy Gaza, and we're going to kick people out. We're going to kick them to the south. None of this is new, right? You can find all of this, go back to 1976 specifically, where Israel tried to build reservations and to move Palestinians completely out of Gaza and into the Sinai. This is on record. Go to the New York Times, you'll see it. Chaim Herzog, who was Israel's representative to the United Nations, brought out a cardboard photo inside the UN and said, these are the reservations we want to move people onto. This is all things that we've seen before. None of it is new. And so I said, you know what? I need to give people context and history, which is something that is completely lacking in coverage, right? There is no context provided to audiences. There is just, as I said in that talk that I gave recently, journalists have become the spokesperson for the spokespersons. So Israel puts out a media release and we just report it as the truth. And it is so egregious. And so that was my idea, was to act as a bulwark against what we were seeing. And then on May 2nd, 2024, students at the University of Toronto started their encampment, and my coverage shifted to where, I was embedded with these students and what they were trying to do. Again, trying to act as a bulwark against the media narrative of these students being useful idiots and, the funding of this. Where is the funding of this encampment coming from? Maybe it's Iran. I mean, again, trying to act as a bulwark against some of this absurd and laughable coverage that the Canadian media was doing of this encampment, And then all of a sudden I found myself in the middle of it, and the Israeli government putting me on the list of the top 4 anti-Semitic people in Canada. And so that was what I was dealing with. So, as I was trying to give history and context to audiences, I find myself being vilified by the state committing the genocide,
Yes.
which was something I was not expecting, right? That was not on my bingo card.
Really? You didn't expect that there'd be this kind of backlash from the well, because you've had it before. You've honest reporting and,
Yes, but to have the Israeli government come for me was not part of that. I mean, honest reporting are people. I think I'm in their Hall of Fame. But they are. I say this to colleagues: if you're not on honest reporting, you are not doing journalism right. And there are journalists at the CBC and other places who are being praised by honest reporting. And I think those people need to take a good hard look in the mirror at their coverage. But, I'll give you an example. Gidon Levy, who writes for Heretics, wrote to me and said, you should wear it as a crown, Samira. So those are the people that I am listening to, not the people, who unfortunately are members of parliament or former members of parliament in our country, or people who are being praised by honest reporting.
I mean, I suppose it could be seen as a sign that you're making a difference, that the apparatus of the Israeli state is coming after you, because that means you're visible and seen as a threat.
I made a commitment, David. I said to myself, if Palestinian journalists are being killed 1 every 3 days, the least I could do over here is to say, this is the hill that I'm going to die on.
Right.
And I hope the bridges I burn light the way, because I don't know what happens after this. I don't know, as a journalist, the moment that you begin to tell the truth on Israel-Palestine, you have to really grapple with how you're going to pay your bills.
Yeah.
Because there is such a campaign from this sort of Zionist side to come after you. And then you have campaign, and then you have the cowardice and the comprador and the careerists on the other side, who, even though they might agree with what you're saying, and they know that what you're saying is true, they just cannot bring you on to tell that truth.
I'm amazed by the ludicrousness of organizations, for example, like the Canary Mission. And I know people who, but what is so bizarre and almost surreal is that something so obviously ridiculous has all of this power. I know people who are terrified. People who are being turned around at the U.S. border because of this stupid canary mission. I just find it baffling, again, out of Orwell or something like that.
But you know what's really, by the way, I'm not on Canary Mission. I don't know what I have to do to get on there. But if you're listening, Canary Mission, put me on and make sure you use a nice photo, okay? The way that these, Canary Mission's not new, right? Even before Canary Mission, there was Campus Watch with the deplorable Daniel Pipes
Right.
Leading the helm there. So these sort of organizations have all been operating under the radar for decades, but now they've really come out into the light. And people are shining a light on them, and rightly so, and speaking out against them. So a lot of people, may have been put on things like Campus Watch or Canary Mission, and they wanted to sort of be on them, but be quiet about it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think people really need to own up to these things.
Mm-hmm.
Don't shy away from being on Canary Mission. Wear it as a crown, as Gideon Levy told me to, and call them out on it.
Yeah, badge of honor. Yeah.
Badge of honor. Where's that funding coming from? Who's funding these organizations, right? Who's paying for that server? I mean, to be up and running. So I think it's important to look at organizations like Honest Reporting. Who's paying for this organization that lives in the minds of executive producers and managing editors in newsrooms across this country? What is their assistant doing when he's caught writing "fuck Gaza" in Toronto neighborhoods? This is Honest Reporting's, executive assistant was charged with 17 counts of mischief, spray painting "fuck Gaza," and yet you have CBC ombudsman sitting there and agreeing with them.
Well, that to me is the amazing thing, that an organization that should be looked on as a kind of crackpot thing, like idiots online, end up with all this power. I'd like to return to the encampment at U of T, because I have several deep connections with it, and you're working on a documentary about it, which is just so exciting to me. What was your connection? You've sort of already said it a bit, but what was your connection to the encampment, and what are your takeaways from what happened? What are the main takeaways from the experience, good and bad, for you in the context of the future of popular movements?
I am a graduate of the University of Toronto, and this encampment sat right across from my college, which was University College. I finished a master's in modern Middle Eastern history from here. And during the time that I was there in 2005 to 2007, when I was doing my master's, was when we would have things like Israeli Apartheid Week. And we would bring people like Robert Fisk to come and speak. Norman Finkelstein would come and speak. And I have a deep connection to that time. It was a very, I guess, in a lot of ways, it really formed my knowledge on the region and my idea of what activism could look like. And then that sort of died out, that era, it seemed to me. I was not seeing Israeli Apartheid Week at the University of Toronto. And what these students were trying to do, really, I think, for a lot of people that I saw inside the encampment, which almost felt like a high school reunion, because I was seeing people that I would stand outside the Israeli consulate with when I was in first year university. I would stand there with the Women in Black. This was the Jewish Women's Coalition. We would stand at the corner of Bloor Avenue Road every day between the hours of 5 and 6 p.m. Silent. Nobody was, yelling anything. It was just a silent, sometimes there would be signs and stuff. And so that student activism really shaped me. And then you couple that with, the degree that I got, etc. And so when I saw these students and what they were doing, I really felt a very visceral reaction to it. And I decided to document what they were doing from the inside, because I was very well aware of how they were going to be characterized from the outside by people who weren't even going to step foot inside the encampment. And I was right. I mean, you go and you look at the coverage and the way that these students were vilified. And so I made that commitment for those 63 days. And, while on the inside, I was seeing things like, Naomi Klein coming to speak, yourself, and others holding Shabbat service there on every Friday night, and seders, and things that were happening on the inside, teach-ins, football games, parents bringing their children on the weekends to have flying kites, etc. On the outside, what was happening was virulent, Zionist pensioners coming and calling the students rapists, terrorists. And you never saw that coverage. You never saw the people who were literally foaming at the mouth, calling these students Hamas supporters, Little Gaza, etc. You never saw that coverage of these people on legacy media, right? And so I wanted to showcase what was happening, not just on the outside, but on the inside also, and sort of juxtapose that with what the media, legacy media, was showing. And so I have about 100 hours of footage. And then what I'm doing with this documentary is to show how students who were at the University of Toronto in the 80s, so the Caribbean Students Association, was characterized by mainstream media in the 1980s who were speaking out against apartheid in South Africa. And you know what I found, David? Which, depending on how you want to look at it, what I found was that those students were characterized exactly the same way by legacy media at the time. They were called racist, violent, irrational. These were people speaking out on apartheid South Africa. And so that gives me hope in weird ways, right? It lets me know that the media is not changing, and that student movements do have the power to change the narrative. And that is why they were being squashed in the way they are by the administration at the University of Toronto. And, the administration of the University of Toronto went kicking and screaming towards divestment from apartheid South Africa, just in the same way that it is kicking and screaming towards divestment from apartheid Israel. The administration at the University of Toronto is actually doubling down on its investments with universities in Israel that operate on stolen Palestinian land. This is specifically the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. So we see the same patterns. And, for a lot of people, that might be disheartening, but I find a lot of hope in that. I'm very hopeful about that.
We are drawing to a close. I'm going to ask you one more question. And it relates to what you were just talking about, because you mentioned the Shabbos and seders and the Jewish presence, strong Jewish presence in the encampment. I work, as you know, at a progressive Jewish organization that takes a lot of pride in allying with liberationist organizations and individuals fighting for justice for Palestine. And I'm going to ask you for some advice.
Oh, boy.
Because you're smart. So what do you think are the limits of Jewish involvement in the anti-genocide pro-Palestinian movement? Do you think, for example, as many of my fellow Jews do, that we have a big part to play in the liberation of Palestine? Or is it and I'm I'm kind of reflecting how I feel. Is it annoying after a while to see us Jews constantly centering ourselves? So is it useful to use our identity for this struggle?
Well, I am of two minds here. And I think, again, it goes back to my just being in the media, and whose voices get centered,
Uh-huh.
and whose voices get uplifted when we want to talk about this issue. So I'll speak from my own personal experience as a producer on Canada's national flagship show, The Current. When we would put Palestinian voices on the air, it was hardly ever live. We would edit them. We would make sure that they don't use words like genocide, apartheid, etc. But when we would put Jewish voices on the air, it was live. They weren't edited. They weren't, they weren't followed up with someone who has to give the other side. And so these are the things that, I see in the media. However, to come back to your question about the role that Jewish people should be playing here, I think they have a central role, 100%. There is no Palestinian liberation without Jewish involvement. And I firmly believe that, because Israel is doing all of this in the name of Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that Jewish people have a central role to play in to say, not in our name, you're not.
Yeah.
And so I really encourage Jewish people to not shy away from speaking out, and don't retreat into this sort of, oh, who am I to be speaking? You are the person that has been inculcated since you were 4 years old to do the bidding of Zionism. So who else other than you should be the one speaking out?
Thanks for saying that. I totally agree. Samira, this has been just a illuminating and wonderful conversation.
Thank you. I have to say this is one of the best conversations I've ever had on this issue.
Oh, goodness. Thanks for saying that. And I want you to have as wonderful a rest of your day as you can, given the circumstances.
This was, I think I got everything that I needed to out of me. So
Good.
I'm going to try and eat a nice breakfast now.
So I'm here. The next time you need a therapy session, I'm here.
Thank you so much, David. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Well, we've come to the end of our show. We'd like to thank you for listening, and we'd like to thank everyone who made our podcast possible, including United Jewish People's Order Executive Director Serena Sarin and our guest, Samira Mohyeddin. This podcast was recorded at Walt Whitman Studios in Toronto. The theme music was composed by Serena Sarin with help from me. I'm David Wall. Until next time, seid gesund.